The memory felt like shattered glass, sharp and piercing. In another life, Caleb had taken Asher's place, becoming a pawn in a game of power, the beautiful, disposable plaything of the governor's son. He'd done it to protect the Aegis Academy, his only home. But Asher, his senior, had only repaid him with scorn. Caleb could still hear the sneering laughter of the other students as Asher recited some decadent, classical poetry, twisting its meaning to mock him as a courtesan. The words had flayed him raw. Then, once Asher inherited leadership of the academy, his first act was to cast Caleb out. Branded, disgraced, hunted by forces he didn't understand, his flight had ended at the edge of a jagged Colorado cliff, a fall into darkness. Now his eyes snapped open. Asher was on his knees before him, tears streaming down his face, his voice choked with desperation. He begged Caleb, pleaded with him to go in his place, to meet the governor's son. Master Vaughn's expression was a mask of strained sympathy, telling Caleb that Asher was destined for leadership, that a man of his stature couldn't possibly be seen submitting to another man. The room, the academy's austere grand hall, was filled with the cacophony of the council members, their voices a rising tide of pressure. Caleb's mind reeled. It was that day. The day Julian Thorne, the governor's formidable son, was set to arrive at their secluded mountain sanctuary. The Thorne dynasty was a political behemoth, and the private world of elite academies like Aegis existed only by their leave. When Julian Thorne, known for his particular appetites, set his sights on the academy's star pupil, Asher, there was no room for refusal. But the idea of the future leader of Aegis being known as a politician's boy toy was unthinkable. It would shatter their reputation. And so they had devised a solution. Caleb would be the substitute, the sacrificial lamb. In his previous life, Julian had not been fooled. The discovery of their deception had been met with a cold, terrifying fury. 50 brutal lashes from a leather belt had torn Caleb's back to ribbons, a searing lesson in the cost of defying a thorn. He had survived by clutching at Julian's pant leg, whispering promises of absolute devotion in exchange for the academy's safety. Julian, his face an unreadable storm cloud, had eventually agreed with a chilling smile. He kept his word, leaving the academy untouched. But he had tormented Caleb for a decade, a slow, meticulous dismantling of his soul. When Julian's father finally stepped down and Julian's own political ascent began, the need for such discreet arrangements waned. Caleb was released, sent back to the mountains. The welcome was colder than the high-altitude air. Asher, his eyes like chips of ice, had informed him that due to a surplus of new recruits, the only available space was a dilapidated storage shed. Caleb, accustomed to hardship, had merely expressed his understanding of the need to prioritize new talent. He'd gathered his meager belongings and settled into the dusty, drafty shed. It was a far cry from the opulent Denver penthouse he'd left, but it was home. He had felt a sense of peace. That night, he had gone to find Asher, carrying a gift. A custom-engraved silver compass he had managed to secure from Julian. It was a rare piece, rumored to have belonged to a famed explorer, and would have looked perfect mounted on the hilt of Asher's presentation sword. When Asher had sent him off to Denver all those years ago, he had clasped Caleb's hand, telling him with false warmth that he had to come back. And so, Caleb had requested nothing else upon his departure from Julian's life, only this one compass. But as he approached Asher's quarters, vile words had drifted out, followed by raucous laughter. It was Asher quoting that same mocking poem to an audience of his peers. He proclaimed that their esteemed academy had no place for a little whore who let men use him. Caleb stood frozen, the silver compass cold in his hand. 10 years of degradation, of shielding Asher and the academy from a powerful man's wrath, had earned him nothing but contempt. The laughter continued, laced with crude speculation about the skills he must have learned to keep a man like Julian Thorne interested for so long. He had retreated to the wind-whipped shed and stared into the darkness until dawn. The next day, Master Vaughn had died suddenly of a stress-induced heart attack. Asher, taking his place, immediately expelled Caleb. He had screamed at Caleb, his face contorted with rage, calling him a filthy thing who had brought shame upon them all. He blamed Caleb for their master's death, claiming the shock of his disgraceful return had been too much for the old man to bear. Asher had Caleb's bag thrown out onto the gravel path and ordered him to get out, sneering when Caleb hesitated, asking if he wanted Master Vaughn's spirit to find no rest. Caleb hadn't even been allowed to attend the funeral. He'd walked down the mountain in a daze, only to see his own face plastered on wanted posters in the nearest town. He had instinctively turned back toward the wilderness, but a team of highly skilled men in tactical gear was already closing in. He ran and he fell. The agony of that memory, a phantom pain of 1,000 cuts and snapping bones, jolted him back to the present. Asher was still kneeling at his feet, his pleas growing more frantic. The council members watched, their faces grim. Caleb found his voice. He would not do it. A wave of shock silenced the room. One of the elders, his face flushing with anger, stood to rebuke him. He spoke of duty, of how the needs of the academy outweighed the selfish concerns of one man. Caleb offered a small, sharp smile and a respectful nod, acknowledging the elder's point. The elder, slightly mollified, began to speak again, but Caleb cut him off. He suggested that if sacrifice was the order of the day, perhaps the elder himself should volunteer. After all, his selflessness was well known. The elder drew a ceremonial blade, his face purple with fury. Just as the confrontation was about to escalate, Master Vaughn's voice boomed through the hall. He told them that was enough. He fixed his gaze on Caleb, his expression shifting. He told Caleb he had always considered him the most reasonable of his students. He asked how Caleb could bear to watch his brother walk into such a terrible situation. Caleb stared back, truly seeing his master for the first time. In Vaughn's eyes, there was no affection, no concern, only calculation. In the last life, Caleb's swift agreement had spared him this naked appraisal. They had asked him to sacrifice himself for their peace of mind, and when he returned, they had mocked him, discarded him, and ultimately led him to his death. They couldn't bear for Asher to suffer, so it was perfectly acceptable for him to suffer instead. Did being dutiful mean one was required to embrace their own destruction? He could bear it, he said, his voice quiet but firm. A beat of stunned silence. Then Vaughn slammed his hand on the polished oak table. He declared that Caleb did not have a choice. It was his grand duty to the academy, and history would remember his contribution. He gestured to the academy guards, ordering them to restrain Caleb. As Caleb's hand went to the training blade at his hip, a calm, cool voice sliced through the tension. A voice he had heard every day for 10 years. Julian Thorne stepped into the hall, flanked by his security detail, men whose quiet professionalism spoke of a level of training far beyond the academies. He moved with an easy, predatory grace, asking Master Vaughn why he seemed so agitated. Caleb lowered his head, his hand trembling slightly. Vaughn stammered out a greeting, trying to pass off the scene as a minor internal matter. Julian simply smiled, seating himself in the master's chair at the head of the table. He remarked that had he not arrived, he might have been unaware they were planning on swapping out the person he had requested. Caleb risked a glance upward and his breath caught. He met Julian's eyes, and a jolt went through him. That heavy, calculating gaze. It wasn't the look of the younger Julian he had first met. It was the impenetrable stare of the man who had effectively run the state for 5 years before his father's retirement. A man who had mastered the art of concealing his every thought. Julian picked up a teacup, his eyes still locked on Caleb. He stated that he wasn't taking a man for free. There would be compensation. That broke the spell. Asher scrambled forward, grabbing at Julian's expensive shoes, sobbing that he was unworthy of such an honor. He then turned and pointed a trembling finger at Caleb. He told Julian to look at his junior, praising Caleb's delicate features and gentle nature, a stark contrast to his own rugged coarseness. Master Vaughn quickly chimed in, extolling Caleb's virtues, his polished manners. Julian took a slow sip of tea. He preferred coarse, he said. More of a challenge. More exciting. The hall fell into a deathly silence. Caleb remembered the men Julian had kept at the Denver penthouse, all of them rugged, physically imposing types. But Julian had never spent the night with any of them. Their presence was a smokescreen. They were dismissed at nightfall, and Julian would come to Caleb's room. He had already learned to hide what he truly desired, even then. He had only ever let his guard down in the heat of passion, tracing the sharp edge of Caleb's canine tooth with his thumb. His voice a husky whisper asking what kind of wildcat he had found, always biting. Take him, Julian commanded. His security team moved with swift efficiency, lifting a wailing Asher to his feet. Asher begged Master Vaughn for help, but the old man could only stand there, his jaw clenched, and tell him to go, that there might be a chance to return someday. Asher knew better. He knew this was a one-way trip, a path to ruin that would strip him of his future, his honor, and his place in their world. Last time, Caleb had borne those burdens for him. This time, Asher would walk that path himself. Caleb felt a grim sense of anticipation. Just as he thought he was free, Julian paused as he passed by. He reached out, tilting Caleb's chin up with one finger. His eyes glinted with a strange amusement. He murmured something about a delicate, polished junior brother. Then, with a soft, dangerous laugh, he looked at Master Vaughn and announced that he would be taking Caleb as well. The journey down the mountain was oppressively quiet inside the armored black SUV. Julian sat across from him, eyes closed, seemingly resting. He suddenly asked if Caleb was afraid. Caleb, tucked into the corner, shook his head before remembering Julian couldn't see, and replied that he wouldn't dare. Julian's eyes opened, a slight smile playing on his lips. He commented on Caleb's surprisingly formal manner of speech for someone from a secluded academy. A knot of tension formed in Caleb's stomach. It had only been a few months for him since he'd left Julian's side. The habits of a decade were deeply ingrained. He carefully explained that he had learned a few things from observing powerful visitors to the academy with his master. Julian changed the subject. He casually asked what Caleb would think if he were to gift Asher to Senator Clarkson. The name hit Caleb like a physical blow. Senator Clarkson, a man whose reputation for depravity was an open secret in political circles. A predator who collected beautiful young things, chewed them up, and spat them out. In the last life, Clarkson had died from a cocktail of STDs contracted at high-end brothels. His end rumored to be grotesque and agonizing. The people who entered his orbit, especially his pets, rarely lasted long. Clarkson's tastes were notoriously rough. A vicious, triumphant thought surged through Caleb. Asher was a trained fighter. He could take it. He desperately wanted to tell Julian it was a brilliant idea. But he kept his face a mask of neutrality, lowering his gaze and murmuring that Julian's initial interest had been in his senior brother, and that it wasn't his place to influence the decisions of a man like him. At the hotel that night, after Julian had showered, he had Caleb brought to his suite. 2 bathrobes hung on a wooden valet stand. One was a well-worn silk robe with a distinctive embroidered pattern, Julian's old favorite. The other was brand new. Julian told him to choose one. Caleb gestured to the new one, suggesting it might be a good choice for the evening. Julian's gaze sharpened. He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a low, intense whisper. He accused Caleb of thinking he could fool him by deliberately choosing the robe he disliked. He asked if Caleb was back, too. His back was to Julian, but Caleb could hear the tremor in his voice, the sudden, sharp intake of breath as Julian moved out of the bath behind him. Caleb quickly muttered that he didn't understand, and excused himself before Julian could press further. He fled to his own room, leaning against the closed door, his heart hammering against his ribs. He was right. Julian remembered everything. The next moment was shattered by a commotion from the courtyard below. Caleb threw open his door to see Julian's security team, materializing from the shadows, pinning Asher to the ground. He had tried to run. By the time Caleb got downstairs, Julian was already there, wrapped in the new bathrobe, looking down at Asher with cold contempt. He held out a heavy leather belt. He was offering Caleb a chance to settle the score for those 50 lashes from their past. Asher's eyes burned with hatred. He spat that Caleb was an ungrateful wretch, asking if he wouldn't even plead for the man who had always treated him so well. Treated him well? The memories were a lie. Asher had always pushed the difficult, thankless tasks onto Caleb while taking all the CR. He'd used him from the very beginning. Caleb took the belt. The first strike cracked across Asher's back. A scream tore from Asher's throat, followed by a stream of curses. The second strike silenced him. They had sent Caleb away knowing full well what would happen if Julian discovered their deceit. They hadn't cared if he lived or died. He had never been ungrateful. They had been inhumanly cruel. He brought the belt down again and again 50 times, until his arm ached and Asher was a broken, sobbing mess on the ground. Caleb knelt beside him, brushing the sweat and blood-matted hair from his face. He asked him softly what part of this was ungrateful. He advised him to save his curses for when he met Senator Clarkson. When Julian presented the bruised and broken Asher to the senator, the older man's rheumy eyes lit up with a feverish glee. He clapped Julian on the back, calling him a true friend, and dragged his new prize away without a second thought. Back in Denver, in the familiar penthouse, Julian didn't press Caleb. He gave him space, though daily reports on Asher's new life arrived like clockwork. Asher was suffering. He was resisting, and Senator Clarkson was finding his defiance exhilarating. Asher was stronger than the usual victims, so Clarkson was enjoying him for days on end before allowing him a day to be patched up by a doctor, only to begin again. Eventually, the reports noted that Asher had begun to submit, to play the part, learning that compliance led to slightly less pain. It was during this time that Julian finally confessed everything. He had been enraged by Caleb's death. He told Caleb he had sent a team to escort him safely back to the academy. But they had been ambushed and wiped out by men loyal to a rival political family, the Stratfords, who had secretly allied with Asher. By the time Julian's reinforcements arrived, they found only rumors of Caleb's fall. He spoke of the aftermath, his voice thick with a chilling hatred. He had unleashed his family's full political and financial might, systematically destroying the Aegis Academy, crushing the Stratfords, and leaving his enemies in ruins. He had done it all for Caleb. Listening to him, Caleb finally understood. His parents had abandoned him. His master had used him. His brother had betrayed him. He had believed no one in the world cared if he lived or died. But Julian had cared. Julian had grieved. Julian had avenged him. Tears he hadn't known he was holding back began to stream down his face. Julian gently wiped them away, telling him that this time, he had arranged the Aegis Summit, the premier event for their world's elite, to be held in a place where Senator Clarkson would be in attendance. Caleb, wiping his own tears, told Julian that he, too, had prepared a special presentation for Asher and Master Vaughn. When the night came, a strange impulse took hold of Caleb. As Julian turned to leave the study, Caleb reached out and caught the edge of his belt. Julian went still, then slowly turned back, his eyes dark and questioning. He asked Caleb if he knew what he was doing, his fingers tracing the side of Caleb's face, brushing against his sharp canine. Caleb bit his finger, gently at first, then harder. The following day, when Caleb finally awoke, Julian was already back from his morning meetings. As they ate, Julian mentioned that Asher was in town for the summit and wanted to see him. Caleb refused without a second thought. Julian smiled, remarking that Caleb had changed. He had thought Caleb would be more sentimental. Caleb returned the smile. Only a saint could survive such betrayal and remain unchanged. But he did see Asher at the summit. The man was a ghost of his former self, gaunt and hollow-eyed, his expensive suit hanging off his skeletal frame. The moment he saw Caleb and Julian together, his dead eyes flared with a venomous hatred. Julian smoothly guided Senator Clarkson away for a private conversation, leaving Caleb and Asher amid the throng of attendees. It wasn't long before Asher was recognized. Whispers followed him, people pointing and smirking. A rival student, a man Asher had frequently clashed with, sauntered by with his friends, making loud, lewd jokes about Asher's new profession, their laughter echoing in the convention hall. Asher, stripped of his weapons and his pride, could only tremble with impotent rage. Just then, the Aegis contingent arrived. Master Vaughn, seeing his former student being mocked, stormed over and, without a word, slapped Caleb hard across the face. He demanded to know why Caleb was letting others humiliate an Aegis man. The crowd murmured, identifying Caleb as the one who had caught Julian Thorne's eye. Vaughn, his face red with fury, raised his hand to strike again. Caleb stepped forward, his voice cold and clear, daring Vaughn to kill him right there if he had the nerve. Vaughn froze. Caleb pulled Asher away, informing his former master that Asher was no longer his concern. The summit's keynote address was interrupted by a disheveled man bursting into the hall, screaming for his father. The man was Director Stratford, the head of a rival security firm and the summit's host. The beggar claimed to be Stratford's true son. He pointed a shaking finger at Master Vaughn, accusing him of violating Stratford's wife, fathering the son Stratford had raised as his own, and arranging for the true heir to be cast away. From the second-floor balcony, Caleb met Julian's gaze. They both smiled. Caleb stepped forward, propelling Asher onto the stage. He announced to the stunned audience that he could prove the man's claim. He pointed out the uncanny resemblance between Asher and Stratford's heir, and the echoes of a younger Master Vaughn in both their faces. He revealed the story of a stillborn second child, a convenient fiction to cover up the swapping of the infants. Stratford, his face ashen, stared from one young man to the other, then collapsed, vomiting blood. The Aegis Academy was finished. Its reputation, built over generations, was annihilated in a single afternoon. The students deserted, the council members scattered, and Director Stratford's people, seeking vengeance, descended on the mountain sanctuary and burned it to the ground. In a sterile holding cell, Caleb and the two half-brothers visited Vaughn. Asher screamed at the old man, cursing him for his ruin. Vaughn tried to appeal to Caleb, babbling about the past, how he used to carry him on his shoulders, begging him to ask Julian for help. Caleb simply asked him if he was the one who ordered Asher to deny him entry to the academy after he returned from Denver. Vaughn's sputtering silence was all the answer he needed. Caleb calmly took the prisoner's meal tray and forced the bland food into Vaughn's mouth, telling him that in his last life, he repaid his debt. This life was for collecting. As he turned to leave, Caleb paused at the door. He had forgotten to mention one last thing. He told Vaughn that his sudden death in the previous life wasn't from a broken heart. It was from the fast-acting poison his dear son Asher had administered, the better to seize control of the academy and cement his alliance with the Stratfords. Vaughn let out an inhuman roar, a madman's shriek in the gloom of the prison. Caleb stepped out into the bright sunlight. Back in Denver, word came that Senator Clarkson had taken Asher to an infamous underground club, the Velvet Curtain. The senator's appetites had grown more extreme. It was said the private rooms were so crowded with bodies one could barely move. Clarkson's health was already failing. Whether Asher would survive the senator's final, desperate bacchanal was anyone's guess. Caleb was packing a bag. For 10 years he had been confined to a gilded cage, and his brief freedom had ended in death. There was a whole country he had never seen. Julian came up behind him, his arms circling his waist, his hands stilling Caleb's. He asked if he was really leaving. Caleb explained his desire to see the world, and Julian understood. He held him tightly, his voice thick with emotion, whispering for him to write, to come back. He said he would wait. 15 years, he murmured, just wait 15 years and he would be free to join him. That night was a desperate, frantic collision. When Julian left for his office before dawn, Caleb, aching in every muscle, forced himself out of bed. His training gave him the strength. As he walked out of the towering Thorn building and into the morning light, he glanced back. He knew Julian was there, watching from a window high above. Caleb raised a hand in farewell. After a long moment, a hand waved back. He turned and walked away, heading south, toward an open road and a life that was finally his own.